Hello, everybody. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about moral foundations theory. All right, now I'm going to try and keep it brief, but there's some good articles. There's even a book that Jonathan Haidt has published in which you could read all about his moral foundations theory, and I encourage you to check it out. Understanding the mechanisms that moral foundations theory lays out can help understand a lot of what's going on, especially in our country today, right? I don't necessarily mean about the quarantine, but certainly about political polarization. But I'll touch on that a little bit later in the video, but I'm going to try to confine myself to just the theory itself. We're going to start with things that led up to moral foundations theory. So Haidt and colleagues made a distinction between moral reasoning and moral judgment. Historically, in the study of moral psychology, people had exemplified moral reasoning. Basically, Kohlberg, which was the biggest name in moral psychology, essentially argued that as children proceed through the stages of cognitive development that Piaget had identified, they also learn to reason morally. All right, and the focus on moral reasoning had, and I believe even to this day, largely continues to be the main focus of moral psychology. But Haidt, or sometimes I see his name or hear his name pronounced Haidt, it's H-A-I-G-H-T. I don't have his book here with me. But Haidt argued in his social intuitionist model that moral judgment is an intuitive process and moral reasoning is actually a post hoc rationalization, meaning essentially that when we're faced with moral dilemmas, we make a quick snap moral judgment. And then the reasons we give for why we made that judgment are actually more akin to a lawyer justifying their position than us explaining why we made that moral judgment. And so he really kind of positions moral judgments as intuitive moral judgments that are made automatically, all right, which we then try to rationalize or justify to other people with moral reasoning. And so he switched the focus in his social intuitionist model. He argued for switching the focus from moral reasoning to moral judgments and understanding the basis and the mechanisms by which people make those moral judgments automatically. Well, he then later proposes that people make these automatic moral judgments based on the extent to which they endorse at least 5 moral foundations. And the original version of moral foundations theory proposed what those 5 foundations were, what they were meant, what kinds of moral domains they were relevant to, and argues that a lot of these moral foundations are actually based in our evolutionary history. Certainly, there are certain aspects of social living that we as humans had that would essentially create selection pressures, would create obstacles that if we didn't overcome, we wouldn't reproduce, that people who had or used these foundations would be able to overcome. So people who use these foundations would be able to overcome these obstacles and reproduce more effectively. And so in his moral foundations theory, Haidt argues that these foundations are worldwide. And in fact, he has found evidence that people in various cultures, everywhere from America and Western European countries, all the way to places like India and China, people all over the world seem to use these foundations. Now, people in more individualistic countries, like America, like Western Europe, tend to dismiss 3 of these foundations, all right? But they tend to still be at least somewhat affected by them. They might make a decision based on those moral judgments, but say that if somebody else made a different decision, it would be okay because it wasn't a moral violation. Essentially, people in individualistic countries like America Western Europe and other westernized countries learn to dismiss some of these foundations, but they still affect them and they're still used. All right, so let's talk about what those foundations were. So, in general, according to the original formulation of moral foundations theory, there were essentially 5 foundations. You had 2 foundations that just about everybody uses. All right, these are the care and harm, and fairness and cheating foundations. And Haidt refers to these, Haidt and his colleagues like Graham refer to these as individuating foundations. These are foundations that help individuals, all right? But then there are 3 other foundations. These are the foundations known as the binding foundations. These foundations help people live and thrive in groups. And humans are a group animal, all right? We're a social species. And so living in a group and maintaining group life is important for us. So let's first talk about the individuating foundations. So the first foundation is care and harm. Now, Graham and Haidt argue that the original function of this foundation was to motivate people to take care of children, all right? For humans, we have a very long developmental period, all right? This is uncommon for most animals on the planet. But because we had that long developmental period, it's even more important for humans to invest in and protect their children. And so it's thought that this foundation developed around that, and so it becomes immoral for us to harm children. Now, sometimes in our current environment, different stimuli can trigger old mechanisms, and it still generates the same output or similar output, but new things can trigger it. But in this situation, it's still roughly the same trigger, distress. The only difference is now distress in adults and distress in others can trigger that foundation. And so when we see these signs of distress in other people, people who endorse the care and harm foundation are more inclined to have compassion to people who are being hurt, anger towards those who are doing the hurting, and feel a sense of caring in general. So again, this foundation helps social life, but it helps individuals, all right? The second is the fairness cheating foundation. Now, this foundation is thought to help people navigate reciprocal relationships. I give you something in return for something else. And sometimes, those reciprocal exchanges may take place over larger periods of time. But it's important that reciprocal exchanges are balanced and equal within a group, because if not, you can get what's called the free rider problem. Specifically, you have somebody in the group taking all the advantages of being in the group, but giving nothing back to the group. All right. So presumably, anything that would have signaled, hey, this is not a fair exchange, somebody's being taken advantage of, would have triggered this foundation. Today, any reminder of exchange, seeing a vending machine, all right, can trigger it. All right, so any kind of cue that, hey, exchange has occurred can trigger this foundation. And what it provokes is emotions related to exchange that particularly guide future behavior in exchange. So if an unfair exchange has occurred, it can trigger anger or guilt, but if a fair exchange has occurred, you got a good deal, right? That can trigger gratitude. But again, you'll note that these foundations, care and harm and fairness and cheating, the care harm, I keep saying careness. The care harm and fairness cheating foundations, they're principally designed to benefit individuals within the group. All right. Whereas the next 3 that we're going to talk about, the binding foundations, are designed to benefit the group. All right. So The first of these binding foundations is the loyalty betrayal foundation. Now, its original function was to maintain the group. I talk about in other videos elsewhere why groups are so important to us as humans over the course of our evolutionary history. Specifically, we are not good at surviving without our groups. And so the loyalty betrayal foundation would, according to Graham and Haidt, would have served to help people maintain those groups, do the things, navigate their social circumstances in ways that would maintain the group. Things that would trigger this foundation include things like violations of group norms. And so when someone's purposefully, blatantly doing things that the group has decided, these are the things we do, you're actively deciding to do something else. That triggers behaviors like defensiveness, excessive pride in one's own group, and anger against the people violating the group. Because now, why would that be? Why would we be angry against people who violate our group norms? Well, if there's too much disturbance, if there's too much disruption within the group, then the group can't hang together very well. Right? They're less able to work together. If I can't reasonably guess what you're going to do, then our ability to work together suffers. All right. We see this even in partnerships. People who trust each other and can kind of predict each other's behavior, partners who have been partners for longer periods of time do better than people who are partners for the first time. Well, if you are behaving according to the norms of the group, then I can expect what you're going to do already. I don't even necessarily have to know you all that well. But if I know that you're conforming to the expectations of the group, I can roughly predict what you're going to do, and so we can work together very quickly, very efficiently, without having an invested long-term relationship. We don't necessarily have to know each other in great depth, but if we're both behaving by the group's norms, we can work together, and so the group can function efficiently. Another group benefiting or binding foundation is the authority subversion foundation. Now, its function was to help individuals navigate social hierarchies. Every social animal on the planet establishes hierarchies, all right? And so there's usually the more dominant individuals, the more submissive individuals. Now, the variation in those status levels are sharper for some species than others, but there's usually always some kind of hierarchy. Well, in situations where people are constantly vying for dominance, the group can't function very efficiently, all right, because there's constant infighting. And so identifying and establishing positions in that hierarchy and appropriate ways to ascend within that hierarchy helps the group work as a whole. And so identifying cues of disrespect, people lower on a status hierarchy blatantly disregarding or disrespecting members higher up in the hierarchy can trigger things like respect or fear for authority. It can embolden people's decision, well, you need to listen to those in authority. It can also lead people to just want to separate, all right? No, this person's being disrespectful, you need to know your place. All right, now that's a very insulting statement to say these days, but essentially that's the idea that people get that people who endorse the authority subversion foundation, they may, when they see people disrespecting others, they may say, listen, let's just split these folks up, all right? So you end up getting people segregating levels of the hierarchy. The third binding foundation and the fifth foundation overall is the sanctity degradation module or foundation. Now the reason this is a binding foundation is because it works to ensure the health of the overall group. All right, because we live with groups, and this is especially relevant right now because we're in the quarantine, part of the reason we're told to socially distance is because when we get into groups, any disease that they have, we can catch. All right. And so one group facilitating behavior is to avoid disease. And so cues like anything that would signal, hey, this person is sick, like bodily fluids. There's work showing that cues of sexual deviancy or novelty can actually operate as a cue of potential disease. I mean, if you think about it, if I don't know an individual, I don't know anything about them, and so they could be carrying all sorts of diseases to me, which would then ultimately spread to my group. All right. So by avoiding them, I'm not only helping myself, I'm helping my group because I'm not getting myself and my group sick. All right. It's the same reason people nowadays are saying to socially distance, because if you catch it while you're out and about, you can bring it back to your family. All right. Like the older people in your family who might be more sensitive to it. All right. Well, so this pathogen avoidance mechanism, the sanctity degradation foundation, is designed to ensure the health of you and your group. All right. Some research suggests that we respond to novel people, like immigrants, in a way that we tend to avoid them, again, because we don't want any infection that they might bring. And certainly, it has been known to happen. In fact, there are a lot of historical examples. For example, when the first European settlers came to America, they ended up bringing smallpox to the Native American population and killing off huge swaths of them. All right. So they brought in a new pathogen that the population wasn't ready for, killing off a lot of them. All right. So certainly, it has this sanctity degradation foundation has an important function. Now, seeing bodily fluids and other cues or triggers, I put sexual deviancy in there largely because all I mean by sexual deviancy is sexual practices that deviate from the norm. All right. And so I know that's taken on a very kind of derogatory term these days, but that's all I mean by that. All right. Now, when we see these cues, all right, it can trigger disgust and trigger harsher moral judgments. All right. In fact, when we make people disgusted through other things, like, you know, some participants completed, if you say completed some questionnaires around a trash can in which a fart bomb had been dropped, all right, that disgust reaction, and they've actually done that. So in a study, that's why I started talking the way I did. When making moral decisions in the presence of a fart spray, participants make harsher moral judgments than when not in the presence of a fart spray. All right. So the Sanctity Degradation Foundation, the Loyalty Betrayal Foundation, and the Authority Subversion Foundations, these are all designed for the benefit of the group. That's why they're called binding foundations. They're meant to keep the group together and keep the group functioning and alive and efficient. All right. Well, what consequences do these foundations have for helping in pro-social behavior? Well, what we know is that the more foundations a person endorses, the better the better able they are to empathize. All right. So if you remember, empathy is the ability to, or at least one aspect of empathy is the ability to take the perspective of another person. Well, if I use a foundation that you use, I can understand how you're thinking about that. If I don't use a foundation that you use, I can't understand how you're making judgments based on that. And so a lot of Haidt's work has shown that in America, political conservatives endorse all 5 moral foundations, whereas political liberals endorse usually only 2 of the 5 moral foundations. And what this ends up happening, based on what I just mentioned, research has shown that conservatives tend to have an easier time at empathizing with liberal perspectives than liberals have of empathizing with conservative perspectives. All right. Now, again, remember that the binding foundations are for the benefit of the group. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's for the benefit of other groups. And so so we might expect that those who endorse the binding foundations would help more, but they wouldn't necessarily help everyone more. So what we know from research involving individualism and collectivism is that those in collectivistic cultures, are more likely to help their in-groups than are those in individualistic countries, but they're less likely to help out-groups than those in individualistic countries. All right, so they help their in-groups more than their out-groups. Well, tying this back to moral foundations, we know that societies that are more collectivistic tend to endorse more of the moral foundations. All right, and so what we might expect is that those who endorse the binding foundations are really likely to help those in their group, but probably not so likely to help anybody they don't identify as being a member of their group. All right. Another potential difficulty of endorsing multiple foundations is having a harder time at balancing the priority of those foundations. All right. If we only endorse 2 of the 5 foundations, then if you're faced with a dilemma, putting loyalty versus, let's say, care, right? A binding foundation, a situation relevant to loyalty versus a situation relevant to care, right? If you're only endorsing the care foundation and you're not endorsing the loyalty foundation, you don't have to balance those. All right. Screw loyalty. I'm going to make sure that my care harm foundation is what I considered a moral issue based on the care harm foundation. I'm going to see to fixing that. But if you endorse both the loyalty and care foundation, suddenly you've got to balance it because they're both important to you. But sometimes you're not able to make a decision that satisfies both of them. And so you have to strike a balance. And striking that balance would seem weird to someone who only uses one of those 2 foundations. All right. Specifically, the balance you strike would probably seem weird to people who only endorse one of those 2 foundations. All right. And so it can create some, we'll say, moral ambiguity for those who have to balance more of the foundations. All right. All right, guys. That is it for this discussion of moral foundations. As always, if you have any questions, please send them my way. If not, have a great one. I'll see you next time.